The Velthri didn't build their academies with windows, not because they feared the outside, but because they believed that learning required the erasure of where you came from. You walked through the entrance gates of the Sorvin Institute, and you left your planet, your bloodline, your gravity behind. You became a student. Nothing more. Maya Chin didn't know any of this when she arrived. She just thought the buildings were ugly. She stood at the entrance to Sorvin's primary lecture hall with a single worn backpack over one shoulder and a thermos of coffee she'd brewed at 4 in the morning because a shuttle from the human residential pod arrived absurdly early. The hall smelled like something between rain and copper wire. The floors were a dark mineral compound, almost like obsidian, and they hummed very faintly beneath her boots, as if the building itself was breathing. Around her, other students filtered in. Velthri were tall, averaging nearly 7 feet, with bodies that moved in a way that unsettled most humans at first. Their joints had an additional pivot point at mid-limb, so when they walked, their arms and legs didn't swing so much as they folded and extended in smooth, mechanical rhythms. Their skin was a deep, matte gray-green, and their faces were broad and flat with eyes positioned wide apart, giving them nearly 240 degrees of vision. They communicated partly through speech, a language humans had learned, and partly through something the Velthri called thurvin, a subtle shifting of the bioluminescent nodes along their neck and jawline that expressed emotional register. The color of those nodes right now, as Velthri students noticed Maya and the 2 other human students entering the hall, was a steady, dim amber. Indifference, she had read in her orientation packet. Amber means indifference. She could work with indifference. Maya had spent the last 3 years at the Applied Contact Sciences program at the University of Colorado, studying xenomechanics, which was a field of engineering that dealt with the design and failure analysis of technologies developed by non-human civilizations. She was 24 years old, the daughter of a welder and a high school physics teacher, and she had grown up in a house where fixing things was considered a love language. Her father fixed cars. Her mother fixed broken arguments. Maya fixed whatever was in front of her. She had not grown up expecting to be here. The Sorvin Institute accepted maybe 4 human students per year into its engineering track. She was one of them. She found a seat near the middle of the lecture hall, set her coffee on the desk surface, which immediately repelled it, because apparently Velthri desks were treated with a hydrophobic compound, a detail the orientation packet had failed to mention, caught the thermos before it rolled off, and pulled out the physical notebook she carried everywhere. The Velthri student who sat down next to her did not look at her. Not once. His name, she would learn, was Dravos. And Dravos already hated her, though she didn't know that yet. Professor Ishenvale was small for a Velthri, barely 6'2", with nodes that flickered frequently between pale green and a soft blue-white. She had studied at 4 different institutions across 2 star systems and had written the foundational text on what humans call stress harmonics in composite alloy structures. The Velthri term for the concept translated roughly to the memory of pressure, which Maya found far more poetic and accurate. She began the class without preamble. Structural failure analysis, she said in Velthri's standard, which the translation earpiece rendered cleanly into English. The study of what breaks, why it breaks, and what that breaking tells us about the thing itself. She paused. And about the people who built it. Maya wrote that down. The last sentence. She underlined it. Dravos noticed her writing by hand. She felt him look at the notebook the way some people look at someone eating soup wrong. He used a Velthri data tablet, which could record, annotate, and cross-reference in real time. Every student in the room used one Maya wrote by hand because she retained information differently that way. She'd known this about herself since she was 12. Dravos was. She would come to understand the kind of student who existed in every educational system in every known civilization. Extraordinarily intelligent, deeply aware of it, and convinced that intelligence was a hierarchy with himself comfortably near the top. His bioluminescent nodes ran cool blue almost constantly, a color that in Velthri emotional register indicated analytical calm, but which, in Dravos's case, had the particular quality of a person performing calm rather than feeling it. His family had built parts of the Velthri's intersystem relay network. He had grown up walking through engineering bays the way Maya had grown up walking through her father's garage. The difference was that Dravos understood his background as evidence of his destiny, while Maya understood hers as simply where she'd started. The first 3 weeks of semester passed without direct incident. Maya kept her head down, did the work, struggled with the Veltri mathematical notation system, which used a base 12 framework and expressed variables as relationships rather than fixed values, and slowly, stubbornly built her footing. Then came the lab session on Veltri pressure vessel design. The class was tasked with identifying the failure point in a scale model of the Sorvin-type containment structure, a vessel used in deep field energy applications, roughly equivalent to what humans would call a high-pressure reactor housing. Each student pair received a model. They had 2 hours. Professor Vale assigned Maya to work with Dreyvos. His nodes went immediately sharply orange. Orange in Veltri register was what happened when a person was insulted and chose not to say so out loud. Maya saw it. She said nothing. She pulled her notebook out and uncapped her pen. "We should divide the analysis," Dreyvos said, his translated voice arriving in her earpiece with a flatness that was not accidental. "I will handle the primary stress mapping. You can observe." Maya looked at the model on the table between them. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, even in miniature, a double-walled structure with an inner lattice that distributed pressure load across geometric patterns rather than concentrating it at fixed joints. Elegant, genuinely impressive. She could already see where it failed. Not because she was smarter than Dreyvos, because she had seen something similar before in a different material, in a completely different context, and the memory lived in her hands as much as in her head. "I'll observe," she said. She let him work for 40 minutes. When Dreyvos finished his primary stress mapping, he placed his data tablet on the table with the quiet confidence of someone who had already written a conclusion in his head. His nodes were blue, steady, certain blue. "The failure point is at the outer wall junction," he said. "The geometric load transfer pattern creates a resonance accumulation at the 4th lateral node. Under sustained pressure, that's where the structure yields." It was a good answer. It was a technically correct answer. Professor Vale, moving to the lab, would have accepted it. Maya said quietly, "That's where it appears to fail." Dreyvos's nodes pulsed. A brief, sharp white, surprise, and then returned to blue. "Explain." She turned the model so the base was facing them. "The resonance accumulation at the 4th lateral node is real, but it's a symptom, not the origin. Look at the base integration layer." She pointed with her pen to a section that, on the model, was nearly invisible without the right angle of light. The base wall coupling uses a fixed phase bond, which means under cyclical pressure, not sustained, cyclical. The bond doesn't resonate, it stutters. Small, rhythmic microfractures. Too small to flag in standard stress mapping. But over time, they propagate upward to the wall geometry, and they're what's actually feeding energy into that 4th lateral node. Silence. "You can't see microfractures in a scale model," Dreyvos said. "You can't scan for them," Maya said. "You can infer them, because the base integration material has a different thermal expansion coefficient than the wall compound. When I held the model earlier, the base was fractionally cooler than the walls. Fixed phase bonds lose integrity earlier in the cooler component. That's the tell." She had held the model for approximately 4 seconds. When she first sat down, Dreyvos stared at her. Then he picked up his data tablet and ran a secondary analysis, a deep layer structural scan that took 12 minutes and required him to recalibrate his equipment twice. The microfracture propagation pattern appeared exactly where Maya had pointed. His nodes were in a color she hadn't seen before, not in her orientation packet. A deep, dark red-violet, slow and spreading, like a bruise forming under the skin. She would ask Professor Vale later what that color meant. Vale would pause before answering. "It is the color of a person discovering that the map they have been using is wrong," she said. "It is not a common color. Most people never experience it in a significant way." Maya didn't feel triumphant about this. She felt something more complicated, something she didn't have a name for yet. The strange, vertiginous weight of having seen a thing that someone else missed, and knowing that the missing was not about intelligence at all. It was about what you had touched before, what your hands remembered. Dreyvos did not speak to her for the rest of the lab. He waited 2 weeks. Maya had almost convinced herself that it was over, that the lab session had settled something, without needing to be spoken aloud, the way some conflicts resolve when both parties silently acknowledge the new information and adjust. She had been wrong about people before. She was wrong about this. He chose a seminar. Professor Vale's class on applied failure philosophy, a discussion format session where students were expected to challenge each other's analytical frameworks. The Velthri considered this kind of structured intellectual confrontation productive and even respectful, a way of stress-testing ideas before committing to them. Maya had come to appreciate it. Dravos waited until she presented her framework for analyzing what she called inherited failures, structural breakdowns that didn't originate in the object being analyzed, but in the process or philosophy that built it. She had been developing this idea all semester, pulling from xenomechanics theory, from her father's practice of tracing car problems backward to the repair history, rather than just addressing the present symptom. She laid it out carefully. The class was quiet in the focused way that meant people were following. Then Dravos spoke. "This is a framework built on human engineering history," he said. "Human engineering history is 400 years old. Velthri engineering history is 11,000 years old. The patterns you're identifying as universal are provincial. You're describing your own civilization's developmental errors and presenting them as structural law." The nodes around the room shifted. Some stayed amber. A few went to pale green of cautious interest. IT was a real argument. That was the thing that made Maya stop rather than respond immediately. It wasn't simply dismissive. It had genuine intellectual content. And she had the self-awareness to recognize that something with genuine intellectual content deserved a genuine response, not a defensive one she thought for 3 seconds. "You're right that my examples are drawn from human engineering history," she said. "They're what I have direct knowledge of. But the framework itself isn't about age. It's about recursive causality." She paused. "Can you name a Velthri structural failure from your engineering history that was resolved by addressing only the presenting failure point, where the same failure category recurred within 2 development cycles?" Silence. "Because if you can," she said, "that's inherited failure. And if it happened in 11,000 years of Velthri engineering, then we're not talking about a human framework. We're talking about a systems pattern." Dravos's nodes went orange, then an uncomfortable flicker between orange and that dark red violet from the lab. "The Varenic relay collapse," he said. Finally, his voice was different now. Quieter, the room shifted. Several Velthri students straightened. Maya didn't know what the Varenic relay collapse was. She made a note to find out, but she could read the room well enough to understand it was significant, that he had named it was significant. "I don't know that event," she said. "Honestly, will you tell me about it?" And something happened in Dravos's face that she hadn't expected. The nodes didn't change dramatically. They settled. The orange drained slowly, and what replaced it was something quieter, a pale, grayish blue that she also couldn't find in the orientation packet. She would learn later it was a color Velthri called Vethuri. Roughly translated, the color is speaking about a wound. He spoke for 22 minutes. Professor Vale said nothing. She stood at the edge of the room and let it happen. The Varenic relay was a deep space communication infrastructure that the early Velthri civilization had constructed over a period of 400 years, 9,000 years ago. It had failed catastrophically. Not once, 3 times, separated by gaps of 60 and 80 years. Each time, the engineers of the era had identified the failure point, repaired it, reinforced it, and declared the system sound. Each time, the failure occurred in a different structural location, but through the same mechanism, a foundational design philosophy that treated signal load as linear, when the actual behavior of deep field communication across Velthri space was cumulative and nonlinear. Nobody had questioned the philosophy. They had questioned the execution of the philosophy, which was different. 47,000 Velthri died when the third collapse severed the outer colony relays. Dravos said they couldn't be reached. They didn't have independent survival infrastructure because the relay was supposed to be reliable. He stopped. "My family's engineering line traces back to the first rebuild," he said. "We have carried that as a legacy, the pride of rebuilding. But also he paused, and the Vethuri color deepened. The question that cannot be answered. How was the philosophy not seen? How did 11,000 brilliant engineers over 400 years not see that the philosophy was wrong?" Maya set her pen down. "Because they were inside it," she said. Because a philosophy felt like physics, like a law, not like a choice someone made at the beginning that everyone else just kept inheriting. The room was very quiet. That's what inherited failure is. Maya said, it's not about intelligence. It's not about effort. It's about the difference between questioning your execution and questioning your premise. The second one is almost impossible to do from inside a system. It usually takes an outside perspective, or catastrophe, and sometimes both. Dravos looked at her for a long time. His nodes were Vethuri, and then, slowly, they shifted to something she had a word for. Green. The calm, clear green that her orientation packet listed as a color of genuine attention. Not respect. Not deference. Not the end of competition. Genuine attention. The color of a mind that has decided to actually listen. She didn't expect him to follow her out. She was walking to the courtyard, which was one of the few outdoor spaces on the Sorvin campus, an angular plaza of dark stone with geometric water features that moved in patterns she found hypnotically precise. She went there most afternoons when the lecture buildings felt too sealed. He fell into step beside her. I was informed before the semester began, he said, that human students were admitted to balance institutional diversity requirements, not on merit. Maya kept walking. Who told you that? My father. She thought about that. Is your father usually reliable? A long pause. Yes. About engineering? Yes. About institutional politics? She asked. Another pause. Longer. I don't know, he said. She stopped at the edge of the water feature and watched the flow shift through its geometric pattern. A basics recursion. She had figured out in her third week, each channel feeding the next in a ratio she found oddly soothing. For what it's worth, she said, I did the same thing you're doing. When I was accepted, I thought about all the reasons it might not be real, all the angles where it might be a mistake or luck or someone's decision to fill a quota. She looked at him. His nodes were a careful, steady green. I spent a lot of energy on that, she said. Energy I could have spent on the work. I stopped when I realized that whether or not I deserved to be here was a question I couldn't answer from inside my own head. The only answer that meant anything was what I actually did with the time. Dravos was silent for a while. The microfracture analysis, he said. You felt the temperature difference in 4 seconds. My dad taught me to read materials by touch before I could do it by instrument, she said. He worked with metal his whole life. He said, instruments tell you what's there. Touch tells you what's happening. That is not in any Velthry engineering curriculum. I know. He looked at the water. It should be. The incident she would later call the fight. Though it was less a fight and more a collision of two people who'd been building towards something for too long, happened on a Thursday. It wasn't with Dravos. There was another student, Rate, third year, older than most, with nodes that ran a particular shade of cool white that several Velthry students had warned Maya about. White, in this context, didn't mean what it meant in the orientation packet. This was a different white, bright, flat, overlit, the color of certainty that had calcified into ideology. Rate had been building a case, spread across multiple seminar sessions, that the admission of non-Velthry students represented a structural dilution of the Institute's research integrity. He framed it in academic language, in systems language, but the content was not ambiguous. He chose to make his argument directly and personally on a Thursday, in the corridor outside the main lab, in front of 8 or 9 students who were arriving for afternoon session. He was precise and measured, and he used very long words, and the substance of what he said was that Maya's presence and performance reflected a lowering of standards rather than a meeting of them, and that her analysis and seminar was impressive only against the baseline of human capability, which was itself a relevant comparison. She felt the words land. She felt where each one was aimed. She recognized the architecture of it, the way it was constructed to be difficult to refute without sounding defensive, the way it wrapped contempt in academic framing to make the contempt harder to name. She took a breath, and she said, evenly, run it. Rate pause. Pardon? Your argument. Tested empirically. Give me any structural analysis problem at the level of this program, and give yourself the same problem and compare the outputs. Not as human versus Velthry, as analyst versus analyst. If my work doesn't hold, the data will show it. She held his gaze. That's what this institution is supposed to be for, isn't it? Rate's nose went white-hot. Bright, affronted white. That is not the point. Then what is the point? She asked. Not loudly, genuinely. And here was the thing she had learned about this kind of argument. When the person making it could not explain what the point was, beyond the feeling that generated it, the argument didn't collapse gracefully. It looked for a different kind of exit. Rate stepped forward. He was a foot taller than her. More, he moved with the fluid, folding Veltri gait, and he moved with deliberate slowness, which was his own kind of language, the language of someone who wants you to understand what size means. And then Dravos stepped between them. Not Maya, not a professor. Dravos. He didn't touch Rate. He just stood there, nodes running a color Maya had never seen before on anyone. A deep, saturated indigo, almost purple, quite still. She's right, Dravos said. Run empirically or don't make the argument. Those are the options in this building. Rate looked at Dravos for a long moment, then at Maya. Then he left. The corridor settled. Maya looked at Dravos. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the floor, that dark mineral obsidian compound, humming faintly. What color was that? She asked quietly. The indigo. Sorvith, he said. She didn't have that one either. What does it mean? He was quiet for a moment. Something I will not allow. 3 days later, Maya found the floor. Not literally. She'd been walking on it for months. But she found what it was. She was in the building's lower archive, looking for historical records on a Varenic relay for a paper she was writing, when she came across the original construction documentation for the Sorvin Institute, built 1,100 years ago. The floor material was documented there, and its properties and its original purpose. The dark mineral compound wasn't just structural. It was a material called vethylene, which had the property of very faint piezoelectric vibration. It generated a low-frequency hum when bearing weight. The original architects had specified it deliberately. The hum was calibrated to the resonant frequency of Veltri biological tissue in a state of focus. The building was designed to vary slightly, subliminally, encourage the neurological state of attention in everyone who stood on it. The building had been trying to make people pay attention for 1,100 years. Maya sat with that for a long time. She thought about her father's garage. The way the concrete floor was always slightly cold, even in summer, and how that cold had a way of keeping you honest when you were under a car, keeping you present, keeping your hands careful. She had never thought of that as design. She had never thought of her father as an architect of attention. But maybe that's what it was. Maybe every space that made people better at thinking was doing something structural to encourage it, and most of the time nobody named it. She wrote this in her paper. Not as a metaphor, as a systems observation. She sent a draft to Professor Vale before submitting it. Vale responded within an hour. Her message was 3 sentences. This is the best paper submitted in the seminar in 6 years. I want you to know that I am not saying that to encourage you. I am saying it because it is accurate, and you should have accurate information about your own work. Maya read it 3 times. Then she went to find Dravos, because she had a question about the Varenic relay data, and also because she had realized, sometime in the last few weeks, that she learned better when they argued, not the way Rate argued, the way people argue when they're both trying to get somewhere true. The semester ended in Sorvin's examination week, which was less a traditional exam and more an extended design challenge. Students were given a real, documented engineering failure from a Veltri historical record, not a model, not a simulation, a real event, and asked to produce a comprehensive failure analysis and a revised design philosophy. Maya received the file and opened it and immediately recognized the failure type from her paper. Not the same event. A different one, smaller, a structural collapse in a Veltri water management system 400 years ago, but the same underlying mechanism, a foundational design assumption that had never been interrogated, only executed. She worked for 4 days. She submitted her analysis at 11 in the evening on the last day of the week. She walked out of the archive building into the campus plaza, into the particular quality of Veltri night. The sky here had a faint, persistent atmospheric luminescence, a greenish light that came from particulating the upper atmosphere and made the dark feel less absolute than Earth dark. and she sat on the edge of the geometric water feature and drank the last of thermos of coffee she'd made at 4 in the morning. Dravos was already there. He was sitting on the opposite edge, looking at the water's recursion pattern. His nodes were a quiet, steady green. They sat without talking for a while. "Did you finish?" she asked. "Yes." "How do you feel about it?" A long pause. "Uncertain," he said. "I am not accustomed to feeling uncertain about my own work." "Is that bad?" He considered this for what felt like a genuine amount of time. "No," he said finally, "I don't think it is. I think it means the question is larger than I initially understood." Maya looked at the water. The recursion pattern completed its cycle and began again. "My mother used to say that," she said, "that the right feeling after doing real work is not confidence. It's the feeling of having gotten close to something real, which is different." "Different how?" "Confidence is about yourself," she said. "The other feeling is about the thing. You stop being the main character of the analysis. The problem is..." Dravos was quiet. His node shifted briefly through Vithuri, the color of speaking about a wound, and then settled back to green. "I owe you an apology," he said, "from the beginning of the semester." "I know," she said, not unkindly. "I believe something false, and I organize my behavior around the false thing." "Your father's map," she said. "Yes." She thought about the floor, about 1,100 years of a building trying to make people pay attention, about her father's cold garage concrete, about the Varenic relay and 47,000 people, and 60 years of rebuilding the wrong thing with great skill and dedication and love. "The hard part isn't finding out the map is wrong," she said. "The hard part is deciding what to do with the territory after." Dravos looked at her in the greenish Veltary night. His nodes were the same steady, clear green they'd been for the last hour. Genuine attention. Still there. "What do you do?" he asked. "You start a new map," she said, with the wrong one still visible underneath, as a reminder. "My dad keeps every bad repair he ever made documented in a notebook, not to punish himself, so he can see how his thinking changed." The water completed another cycle. "I would like to see that notebook someday," Dravos said. Maya looked at him. "I'll ask him." Above them, the atmospheric luminescence shifted slightly, the way it did when the wind changed, and the green deepened for a moment into something richer and darker, the color of a world that had been here long before either of them and would be here long after, holding its questions in the patient, humming ground beneath their feet. She made a note in her notebook. She didn't know yet what it would become. That was, she had learned, exactly the right place to start, and